Hello and welcome to this video on the right and left realist perspective of crime and deviance. Firstly, some background. It is worth realising that these perspectives are somewhat more political than the other sociological perspectives we have looked at, and that's really quite saying something when we consider that we've looked at the Marxist and neo-Marxist perspectives. Realists see crime as a problem to be tackled and not a social construction by social control agencies. They believe that over the last 100 years or so there has been a rise in crime, and they are concerned about the impact of this rise in crime, but also the impacts of the increased fears around crime and being a victim of crime that abound in our societies. They believe other theories do not propose solutions, that the other perspectives we have looked at simply look at crime and deviance as an academic area of study rather than proposing solutions for bringing about changes and improvements in this area. In particular, realism emerges firstly in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where we saw a big political shift from the left to the right in the West. In particular, people like Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party and ultimately Prime Minister in 1979. Ronald Reagan became leader of the Republican Party and ultimately President, also in the United States. They were good friends. They were very much members of the neoliberal New Right. They had a strong commitment to law and order and believed that we could improve the situation with regards to crime by engaging in more harsher sentencing. In the UK, that took on the form of longer prison sentences, whereas in the US, that tended to be spreading the use of the death penalty. Right realism was the first of these two perspectives to be born, and in many senses, left realism is a response or reaction to it. So, right realists believe that crime is on the rise and that this threatens social cohesion and the work ethic. Therefore, the criminal justice system and the state needs to take a zero-tolerance approach when dealing with crime and criminals. That is to say, we should be heavy-handed in dealing with criminals and hand down harsh sentences when they are caught. The neoliberal New Right in the 1970s and 80s argued that none of the sociological approaches that we have studied to date worked or provided real solutions outside of the Marxist perspective, which generally argues that capitalism is criminogenic, and so therefore we need to get rid of capitalism. For neoliberals and the New Right, being very much pro-capitalism, this is not something they would be willing to engage with. Ultimately, there's a shift away here from focusing on the causes of crime, ultimately to controlling and punishing crime itself. So no more looking at poverty as a catalyst, right realists would say. Instead, these people know that they're committing criminal and deviant acts, and they must be punished for them. Right realists argued that other sociological viewpoints were simply too sympathetic with criminals, that they tended to argue, for example, in terms of interactionism, that somehow the criminals weren't entirely at fault, that they'd been labelled negatively, and this had led to a self-fulfilling prophecy of criminality and deviance, and that we therefore needed to do something about that rather than ultimately punishing the individuals. And for right realists, they would say, well, hold on a moment, we have victims here. We need to be thinking about the victims first rather than the criminals. Right realists also reject Marxism's claim that poverty leads to crime, arguing that, well, if we were to look at another demographic that can often be poor, that is the old, they do not commit crime, and so therefore it is not excusable that the working classes or the underclass commit crime. Right realists posit a range of different causes of crime, the first of which is biological differences. They buy into a biosocial explanation of crime. They say that some people are naturally criminals, that it's almost in their DNA. They are programmed to be more aggressive, more impulsive and less intelligent. And that combo is enough to potentially put a person in a position where they're likely to commit crime and deviance as a result. The next cause of crime they identify is ineffective socialization. That the traditional nuclear family is required to teach children right from wrong, so you've got to have mum and dad, both there engaging in primary socialization. They identify that in our society we have a new growing underclass who are failing their children. The underclass is a thin strata at the bottom of the working classes who are completely reliant upon the welfare state and do not work. We often find the families from the underclass are single parent families, usually single mother families, and this is actually caused by the welfare state, right realists would argue. And so they're very much echoing that neoliberal New Right viewpoint. They would say the lack of paternal role models and discipline handed down by a father figure ultimately means that the values of hard work and self-improvement are not being taught, in particular to boys, and this underclass therefore threatens the very fabric of society. This is something that needs to be dealt with, and the nuclear family needs to be promoted more. Margaret Thatcher in particular was very heavy-handed in her views of single mothers, and there's lots of concern that continue abounds to today of young men growing up in a scenario where dad is not around to lay down the law. The third explanation with regards to the causes of crime that right realists posit is rational choice theory. They argue that all individuals have free will and the power to reason. If, in this current scenario, the perceived benefits of something outweigh the potentially negative consequences, an individual will rationally undertake that act, also known as a cost-benefit analysis. If the perceived costs of crime are low, and right realists are currently claiming that the sentences that are handed out as punishments are currently far too lenient, and therefore this is why we need to take a more zero-tolerance approach and raise the cost of crime, because if we raise the cost of crime, people rationally will do their cost-benefit analysis and realise, well, actually, it's not a good idea to commit the crime, because if I do get caught, I'm going to be punished very harshly. Whereas currently they would argue that at the moment people are weighing them up and going, well, even if I do get caught, not much will happen. And so they commit the act of crime and deviance. Right realists put forward some interesting ideas with regards to how we should tackle crime, saying that firstly we should focus on the control, containment and punishment of crime rather than focusing on the causes as other perspectives would. They use what is known as broken windows theory to explain this. So they say that we need to ensure that neighbourhoods are well kept, that broken windows are fixed, graffiti is cleaned, that streetlights work, there's no rubbish or litter on the floor. And this is because when an area is allowed to go to rack and ruin, it acts as a magnet for criminals and deviants to turn up and engage in their behaviour there. It's a catalyst, therefore, of greater crime and deviance. The police also need to be out controlling the streets, being bobbies on the beat. They need to catch drunks, prostitutes, beggars and move them on so that the streets are for the law abiding. We should also be using fines and prison sentences as a deterrent to show people that potentially would commit crime and deviance that the costs of crime are high. When zero tolerance was first introduced in New York in 1994, which up until this point had been seen as an area of lawlessness almost, that there was large amounts of crime and deviance occurring, it was applauded for reducing crime. But actually, other sociologists such as Jock Young have argued that, in fact, zero tolerance is simply an urban myth, and that its success was a myth because crime was already falling from 1985 onwards by the time we get to 1994. So actually there doesn't seem to be a fit or a correlation between the implementation of zero tolerance and ultimately the fall in crime. Also, we find that in cities where they are not using zero tolerance policing, ultimately crime is falling. And it's worth saying that generally speaking, crime has been falling over the last 30 years or so, although we do see one or two spikes more recently. Police arguably also use arrests to justify their existence, leading to heavy-handed policing. So because the police want to show themselves to be indispensable, they almost artificially push up the number of arrests they engage in to show how important it is that they continue to exist. Right realists claim that cracking down on smaller crimes caused the decline, when in fact it was simply a way of coping with a decline that had already occurred. You could argue that in many ways right realists were bandwagoning on the back of a decline in crime. In terms of criticisms of the right realist perspective, well, firstly, they ignore poverty, and whilst this is purposeful on their part, it does seem somewhat ridiculous that this should occur. Throughout human history, poverty has clearly been a real driver or a driving force behind criminality and deviance, and that doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon. And to decide to simply ignore it for an ideological reason seems somewhat short-sighted. Rational choice theory does not explain non-utilitarian crimes. Whilst it explains why one person might commit a crime if they're going to become richer, if a non-utilitarian crime, such as vandalism, one does not become richer. And so why would one ever logically decide, I'm going to do this because I feel that the cost of this crime would be very, very low should I be caught? Surely, for something as ridiculous or silly as vandalism, the cost of crime is always too high. Next, rational actors freely choosing to be criminals is in conflict with the view that some are biologically predisposed to crime. This is the nature versus nurture argument, and generally as sociologists we will take the nurture argument whilst recognising the importance of nature. It would appear that in this sense right realists are trying to have both at the same time, both their cake and eat it. Zero tolerance focuses on petty street crime rather than corporate crime, so in particular Marxists and left realists and neo-Marxists would say this is a concern. Zero tolerance often leads to the displacement of criminal acts. So, okay, whilst it won't be happening in New York City in our example anymore, it may be happening in another city in another part of the United States, or indeed the world. In response to right realism, there was a big concern in the more left-wing circles of both sociology and indeed policymakers generally that their views on crime were no longer being taken seriously. What we were seeing was a decline at this time of the USSR and communism and Marxist thought. And so a range of Marxists, both of traditional and neo varieties, as well as other interactionists and other perspectives, started to think, well, maybe we need a more interesting, more innovative response to the rise of right realism. So they decided, as led by Jock Young, to agree with certain aspects or premises of right realists, such as we need to take crime seriously, and that actually we need to respond to growing influence of right-wing government policy by accepting and giving some ground to these theories. They see society as unequal under capitalism, which is very similar to Marx's, but advocate reform rather than revolution, so a slow, gradual change rather than the violent overthrow of the capitalist state. So this was part of the project of taking crime seriously, to acknowledge that crime had increased since the 1950s, because interactionist Marxists and neo-Marxists seemed to be claiming that this wasn't the case, that rather we were just getting better at reporting crime more, or recognising crime, or creating new rules, aka crime was socially constructed. Left realists argue that the increase is too great to be accounted for in this way. Ultimately, left realism would have a big impact on the policies and thinking of the new Labour government from 1997 onwards. And actually, you can see the whole kind of theory of bringing together more right realist and left realist ideas, or right realist and Marxist, interactionist, neo-Marxist ideas into a third way, as quoted here by Tony Blair. He said that when he became Prime Minister, he was going to be the leader of a party that is the party of law and order in Britain today, tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. Tough on crime is very much the right realist approach. Tough on the cause of the crime is this left realist approach. Taking crime seriously also involves identifying the main victims of crime, and again, that's generally the disadvantaged, generally the working classes, which previously other perspectives had not always identified. In terms of the causes of crime, the first, which is identified by left realists, is relative deprivation. For Lee and Young, crime has its roots in deprivation. They identify how deprived someone feels in relation to others, or compared with their own expectations. This can lead to crime when people feel resentment that others unfairly have more than them, and resort to crime to obtain what they feel they are entitled to. Lee and Young identified that although people are generally better off, and so we're not talking about absolute deprivation here, they are now more aware of relative deprivation due to the media. They are more aware of what they have or don't have vis-a-vis other people in their society, and this leads to this feeling of relative deprivation. For Young, the lethal combination is relative deprivation and individualism. Individualism placing the self first before the collective. It causes crime by encouraging the pursuit of self-interest at the expense of others or the collective. For left realists, increasing individualism is causing disintegration of families and communities by undermining the values of mutual support and selflessness on which they are based. The second cause of crime that left realists identify is subculture. The left realist view of criminal subcultures is very similar, in fact, to the views of Merton, Clode, Olin, and Cohen. So left realism are actually borrowing elements of functionalism here. For left realists, a subculture is a group's collective solution to the problem of relative deprivation. However, different groups produce different subcultural solutions to the problem, and they're not therefore always negative, some can be positive. For left realists, criminal subcultures still subscribe to the values and goals of mainstream society, such as materialism, so owning material goods, and consumerism, wanting to buy and purchase material goods. The third cause of crime that left realists identify is marginalisation. marginalised groups lack both clear goals and organisations to represent their interests, whereas groups such as workers have clear goals and organisations that can put pressure on, say, employers and politicians. As such, they have no need to resort to violence to achieve their goals. They can, for example, go on strike. By contrast, unemployed youths are marginalised, they are essentially ignored, they have no organisation to represent them and no clear goals, just a sense of resentment and frustration. Being powerless to use political means to improve their position, they express their frustration through criminal means such as violence. And perhaps this helps to explain why we saw the riots many years ago. With regards to how left realists believe we should go about tackling crime, firstly, they argue we must both improve policing and control, which is very right realist of them. But we must also deal with the deeper structural causes of crime, which sounds or echoes more like the neo-Marxist, Marxist and interactionist views. Kinsey, Lee and Young argue that police clear-up rates are too low to act as a deterrent to crime, and that police spend too little time actually investigating crime. Perhaps they're caught up in bureaucracy and red tape, or else they simply don't have the resources to police an area fully. It's worth remembering the police depend on the public to provide them with information about crime. But the problem is that the police are now losing support, especially in inner cities, such as London. And the flow of information dries up, therefore leads the police to engage in military policing, which is where they flood an area and they will, for example, begin to use stop and search in a very heavy-handed way. This alienates communities who they see the police as victimising them, and in particular their youngsters. Left realist views on government policy has strong similarities, therefore, once again, as said previously, to the new Labour stance on crime, that is, be tough on crime, but tough also on the causes of crime. However, Young regards many of the policies that New Labour implemented as nostalgic and doomed attempts to recreate the conditions of the golden age that supposedly existed in the 1950s. And in this sense, he's almost arguing that very little was different between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's New Labour project and that of the Conservatives under Thatcher previously. Young also criticises the record of governments generally. He argues that they have largely only addressed the symptoms such as antisocial behaviour, that is to say they have been tougher on crime than on tackling its underlying causes. With regards to criticisms of left realism, Henry and Milanovic argue that the left realists accept official definitions of crime as street crime committed by the working class, and that there should be more focus on corporate crime. So this is kind of a Marxist or neo-Marxist approach. Interactionists would argue that the focus on quantitative data in official statistics rather than qualitative data does not reveal offenders' motives, and neo-Marxists would probably echo this as well and say, well, how can we have a fully social theory of crime and deviance if we're not going to drill down and zoom in and find out why individuals were engaging in this behaviour? Thirdly, the use of subcultural theory means left realists accept the existence of a shared value consensus, and therefore that crime only occurs when it breaks down. The problem here is generally Marxists and neo-Marxists who may have fed into the left realist project would not accept the existence of that. They would argue that instead it's a ruling class ideology, a ruling class set of values that are being handed down to maintain capitalism. Relative deprivation cannot fully explain crime, as not all who experience relative deprivation commit crime. To an extent, living within a capitalist economy by its very nature is going to create a sense of relative deprivation, and yet it's worth remembering most people are not criminal. That's it. Thank you very much.